If you're interested in getting into project management or program management, this video is for you. I'm going to go into a whole bunch of details, lots of things to consider, but let's do a quick intro. I've been in the field for 3 decades. I've managed over $2.5 billion worth of technology and merger and acquisition and strategic type projects and programs, written 7 books on the topic, spoken at dozens of conferences. So I'm kind of a project management nerd, and so I wanted to share my experiences. What we'll go through today is first, what is project management? So before you said you want to get into it, it probably makes sense to understand what it is. We'll talk about why it's a good career. I believe there's a certain set of competencies and skills that make people successful. The good news is, I think several of them are part of your personality and you already bring to the table. We'll talk about some tips to how to get started, and that's fine if you don't have a lot of experience, and lay out sort of a 4-week, 30-day plan as a way to get started. So let's jump into it. So, first, what is a project? And at its simplest definition, it's a temporary endeavor. There's a start and a stop. And so, unlike ongoing operations in a company that just keep going and going, a project has a discrete set of scope with a discrete timeline and a unique outcome. So, there's a specific outcome that we're trying to get to, whether it's delivering a new system, deploying a service, or some sort of other result. And as I mentioned, it has a defined scope. There's a very specific set of objectives and requirements that need to be delivered in the time period that's outlined, and generally there's a time target, release this system by this date or deploy this new program. They are always resource constrained, and whether those resources are people, whether they're financial, whether it's materials, there's always a constrained set of resources that need to be considered, and they generally require a lot of collaboration with different stakeholders and team members and organizations across your company. And a lot of times they require change. They implement change because we're improving a process or rolling out a new system or a new product. And we're implementing change and transformation, which is one of the exciting things about working on projects. So then what is project management? At the end of the day, the project manager helps the company achieve their goals. And we bring a lot of the things to the table. So first is just structure and discipline. Generally, projects are really complex with a lot of moving parts. And what we bring to the table is first bringing structure to those moving parts, and then helping to plan and organize the work and the resources aligned to that structure. Generally, we have sort of a goal-oriented approach that makes sure that we deliver the things that we say we're going to do while focusing on the end goal and what we're trying to deliver within the constraints that are outlined. It is a lot of coordination, as I mentioned, of people, of activities. So there's a lot of moving parts that we have our hands around, which generally means we have good time and resource management skills, right? We can balance the many deadlines while still staying in with budget and the resources. Projects will always have risks and issues. So we're anticipating the problems before they happen, right? That's the risk management. And then when they do happen, they become issues. Then we manage them to closure as quickly as possible. And then we spend a lot of time as sort of a communication hub. So whether that's collaborating with teams, whether that's communicating information to stakeholders or leaderships. So that's sort of what I'd say project management is discipline with a goal-oriented process, lots of coordination, balancing the constraints that we have, driving risks and issues to closure, and then a lot of communications. So why is it a good career? A lot of people look into project management as a career. I've worked in many Fortune 100 companies and consulting companies, and every place I've seen has sort of project managers in their organizations. And I'll say companies are continuing, because of the competitive landscape, they're continuing to invest significant amounts of money into strategic investments. And so what that means is there's a lot of projects and programs in companies. So that means there's high demand in every industry. So there's a lot of demand for our skill sets. Because we bring a skill set that sort of allows us to deliver uh, any kind of project. The good news is I think we have career mobility. So, for example, I did technology projects for a long time. Then I went to a property and casualty insurance company. Then I went to a healthcare company, and now I'm at another consulting company. I believe I could go work on a construction project tomorrow, and while I don't know a lot about construction, I know about how to deliver large projects and programs. So I think it just allows us sort of a lot of mobility within our careers. If you like organizing and you like working with teams, this is the role for you because I mean, as I mentioned in the last page, that's what we do. I think it allows leadership opportunities without necessarily the title, which may or may not be a good thing, right? It poses its own challenges. Generally, it pays really well. There's certifications that I'll get into later that build credibility around what you're working on. And you get the satisfaction of completing something, right? Working on a project means you're delivering an outcome. And for those of us who get satisfaction from having accomplishments, then that's the funny thing is you'll work for 2 years, then you get the satisfaction of completing the project, and then, for a week, and then you start your next project. And I tell you, you'll never be bored. There's so many things happening and fire drills and things to put out. And you may even get to be a hero, right? To help deliver some of the more strategic initiatives in a company. So, what does a typical PM career look like? And this is sort of a generic sort of ladder career, if you will. That a lot of the companies I've worked at have sort of similar models, and some are kind of different, but they're all generally the same. Is starting out as an assistant, so that's helping the project, maybe working in what's called a project office or a program office, with some of the maybe the more administrative tasks around documentation or organizing information, or some of the program operations. And then coordinators start working on the projects, helping with logistics, tracking tasks. Maybe they shadow a PM, they ensure information flows, they help with some of the reporting. And then sort of you have your core project manager that has a project that has a discrete scope and schedule and budget, and they sort of manage that. They guide the team, they do all the reporting. And then as you move up, you take on larger initiatives. So either you have a more complex project, in which case you're a senior PM, or you have a collection of projects, which is known as a program, that you're managing the program, and you might have PMs under you that manage the individual projects. So they're more complex, they require more coordination, generally more visibility. And then you're the director that either oversees the function or you might manage a portfolio of programs. So a portfolio is made up of multiple programs, which are made up of multiple projects. But so the good news is generally there's a pretty good career progression in project management, which is another benefit of why you might want to consider it. So let's talk about the competencies. And I am a big fan of competencies in terms of the kinds that you need for project management. And I think about them in sort of three categories. The first are sort of the fundamentals of PM. So, what do you need to do to manage plans and manage budgets and manage risks? And so these aren't skills so much as the competencies, the things that you bring to the table in terms of how to do the work. And those are things like organizing and structuring and planning and being aware of risk and having good time management skills because there's a lot of work that needs to get coordinated. Maybe it's engaging with stakeholders or managing financials. As mentioned, there's a lot of communication, and then there's sort of using the different PM tools. And to me, those are the basics. Those are the fundamentals that are needed for the job. But then there's the softer skills. Because most projects do not have formal management and they're matrixed and you're working with part-time people, there's a lot of what I call consultative skills that are needed um, to coordinate all those moving parts. And that's things like self awareness and how you interact with other people, and taking ownership of work, and bringing diligence, and being able to influence and negotiate and facilitate. Again, there's so many moving parts. And then there's the acumen, which is how much knowledge do you have in a particular business area or an industry or your products. Like, I'm a big believer that the PM should know something about the works that they're doing, which also includes the systems and technologies. But here's the good news is, so now let me sort of color code, and you can see I overlaid some of the colors here. Um, I think there's certain skills and competencies that people are just naturally have. And when I interview people, those are the ones that I look for. Those are sort of the orange ones, right? Attention to detail and how you learn, and judgment and ethics and time management are just things that are sort of innate to somebody and how they work. Then there's the things that I think you can learn. So those are the blue things. So I generally believe that somebody can learn about the business, or learn about the systems, or learn about how to manage budgets, or use a certain PM tool. And then the green ones I think are kind of in the middle, right? So some communication skills I think are sort of natural to a person, and some of them can be learned. But I think the lesson here is that um, if you have a lot of these skills that you bring to the table, you already have a really good starting point, because you can learn a lot of the other ones. And I won't drain it, but in the upper right here, this is based on a book that I wrote probably about a decade ago called The Consultative PM, that gets into the competencies and how to build them. So let's talk about some of the tools of the trade. And so there's sort of four categories of tools that PMs work with. And this is how I think about the different kinds of tools. So the first bucket is planning and managing. So those are tools that help the PMs sort of design the plan, break down the work, assign responsibilities, and balance resources. So things like the project plan, right, that have your activities and milestones and dependencies, the roadmap, the resource and capacity plan. What are people working on and how long are they allocated? That's sort of the core managing the plan. I think about, if PMs are carpenters, like that's our hammer, right? That is the primary tool that we work with. But then there's a lot of monitoring and reporting, and that really means providing visibility into the health and the risks and things like key performance indicators. And so there's a lot of metrics and dashboards. If you're working in Agile, there's a whole bunch of tracking tools and Kanban views and all that kind of stuff that give you a sense. But that's the way that we know that our project is on track, and we recognize some challenges that we might have so that we can knock them down as quickly as possible. Then there's reporting. We spend a significant amount of time reporting, especially with large programs with large dollar amounts. Generally, companies want to know, well, how am I doing for all the money I just gave you? And so that's the turning the project data into insights for all sorts of different stakeholders. So status reports, executive presentations, newsletters, things like that. And then finally, because we work on large teams, there's a lot of collaboration and communication required. So that's where we can centralize conversations, we can put files and document repositories and so on to keep stakeholders aligned. So generally, we're working with these four kinds of tools. Typical project lifecycle. And again, there's lots of different methodologies out there with waterfall and Scrum and Agile and so on. But generally, projects sort of work this way, which is initiation is early on. Somebody has an idea, they want to think through what it is. Maybe they come up with a charter, or they have some high level objectives. But then you get into planning, right? What is the work? What are the people needed? What are the categories, or maybe the structure of the program? Some high level estimates, some high level solution, right? What does this thing actually look like? And then that's generally where sort of approval happens. And then you get into managing the project, the execution, which is then delivering against the plan, managing the resources, all the reporting that's required. And that's where that monitoring and controlling comes in into sort of the cycle, right? Because in some cases you have to, especially with Agile, you sort of replan with new different cadences and things that are called like program increments, for example. And then ultimately you finish the things you're supposed to do, because remember the first slide, a project has a finite start and end. So then you close out, and there's things to do to document lessons learned and finalize the project. But generally, this is sort of a life cycle of a project. So sounds good. You want to become a PM, but you don't have a lot of experience. So what do you do? And here's 6 recommendations. First is learn as much as you can about some of the methodologies. Agile and waterfall. There's so much content out there in terms of methodologies. And if you're watching this video, that means you know how to access videos and YouTube channels and things like that. So just poke around and see what you can find. But nothing beats experience. So I think volunteering for work like projects. And I'll tell you, there's so many places at charities or community events, or offering to help your friends out, to just lead an initiative. And lots of things could be projects that you can create a plan for, and you can manage and you can report on. I also think shadowing a PM is really really beneficial. So you get a sense of what do they do and how do they operate and how do they use their tools. You can ask them questions and so on. And then build your portfolio. Start documenting the things that you've been doing so that you sort of have that history of it. You might want to consider some certifications, and I'll get into detail in those in a second. And then just using the tools, getting experience with different, PM type tools. So these are all ways that you could start building some experience so that you get a sense of what it means, and you start building out your experience. And as mentioned, that includes understanding what are some of the common PM documents. And here's just a bunch of the sort of the basic ones that are used. The project charter is generally early on in a project. It defines the scope, the objectives, the structure, maybe the ways of working. And to me, it's sort of the most important document in a project because it outlines sort of what it is. And as new resources come on board, you can hand them the charter and then they'd get a sense of what is the project. The plan, right? That's our hammer. That's all the list of activities and tasks and milestones and resources working on it. The schedule is more of a visual view of when the deliverables are due. RACI is for roles and responsibilities. So, what is the business analyst doing? What is the PM doing? A really important deliverable for clarifying who's working on what. Then we've talked about risks and issues. That's called a RAID log. That's risks, actions, issues, and decisions in one place. I talked about lots of status reporting, and sometimes if you're working in waterfall, there's something called a change request that can document the different changes. Then there's different types of certifications. So if you want to get some industry credibility and you want to learn a little bit about project management, there's a couple of different kinds of certifications you can get. So there's entry-level certifications. So PMI, the Project Management Institute, is sort of considered the sort of authoritative body of all things project management. And they have what's called their CAPM, their certified associate and project manager, I think, which is really for newcomers to get a sense in some of the basics. I know Google has a certificate. There's all sorts of LinkedIn learning that you can, put on your LinkedIn profile, and some other ones you can see here. Then as you're more advanced, PMI has something called the PMP, the Project Management Practitioner. I've got my PMP about 20 years ago. It does require some prerequisites, a certain amount of work experience. You have to take a test, but that one's more advanced. And then, as mentioned, a program is an aggregation of projects. So there's the PGMP, which is their program management one. Prince 2 is another methodology. I think it's pretty big in Europe and some other places that you might want to consider. And then other areas, Agile's not really a project management skill set, but a lot of companies are moving there, so that might be considered as a certification. Similarly, if you work in an infrastructure area, ITIL is a pretty good methodology for that. So like I said, there's lots of certifications, and based on where you are and the company you work for, you might want to consider different ones. So let's get into sort of what's the 4-week plan. So how do I get started? And again, this is just sort of a directional idea here. But week 1, learn as much as you can. What is the basic PM terminology? What are some of the tools? Maybe you can, explore some of them, review some of the deliverables I mentioned a couple slides ago, and set up a project and start experimenting, play with tasks, and figure out how to do dependencies and assign resources. Now that you've got a sense of the tools, shadow a PM. Sit in on meetings, watch what they do, watch what they say, maybe even say, hey, can I update some of the, the risk log or the plan or the action item log based on what happened in the meeting. Volunteer to take, hey, can I run these 3 things down for you? And then really watch how they operate, because a lot of being a project manager isn't necessarily the what, it's the how. It's how do you operate? How do you interact with others? Those sort of consultative skills that I talked about. And then build your first schedule. Just define a simple project scope, create a timeline, assign some people to it, pick a project management tool. It could be Excel. It doesn't have to be some crazy, expensive tool. And then review it with the mentor. Have them look at it, give you feedback on it, and then lead your first meeting in the final week, right? Prepare the agenda, facilitate the conversation, share your schedule, share whatever the status, get status from resources, and then ask for feedback on how you did. So just one recommendation on sort of how to get started. Well, when you're new, you want to build credibility fast, and these are some ways of doing that. Since PMs is all about delivery, you want to be reliable and you want to deliver on what you say. And part of that is communicating clearly and often. I mentioned communication is a big part of the role, which includes keeping the stakeholders aligned and informed. When there's risks or issues, you want to be transparent. You want to tell people about them. You want to ask questions. I think learning the project details, I mentioned this in sort of acumen, is important. You don't want to be the expert, and there's actually not an expectation that you are the expert. Your job is to drive things and facilitate getting things closed, not be the expert in the solution. But you want to learn as much as possible so that you understand what people are talking about, because then you can sort of help execute against that. You want to run efficient meetings and you want to support the team, right? So I know it says project manager, but it's not about managing people. It's about managing the project. And a lot of times those resources don't even report to you. So it really is all about the team. The team is what's going to make the project successful. So you want to support them, you want to build trust with them, you want to build credibility with them. That is probably the most important tip I could recommend. And there's pitfalls you want to avoid. So not doing enough planning is a big challenge because you're going to get into the project and there's going to be lots of challenges that weren't thought of. I'm a big fan of when you identify problems, and that's fine to escalate, but you want to come with recommendations, not just here's a problem and then you make it somebody else's problem. Is you want to work with the team to come up with some recommendations. Not knowing what the scope is a problem because how do you know what to work on the project? And you're not going to be able to please everybody because there's so many stakeholders with so many opinions that it's just not going to be possible. As I mentioned, risks and issues are going to happen. If you ignore them, they're going to become bigger problems that could stop your project altogether. And sometimes that requires engaging with other people. So you don't want to avoid the tough conversations, especially if you have to follow up with somebody to get things done and to move work forward if they're stalling it. Status reports that don't say anything. I can't tell you the number of status reports that I've seen that were, had meeting. And it's like, well, that's great, but it's not helpful. So you want to make sure when you're communicating something that's actually valuable and of interest to your stakeholders. I've talked about transparency a bunch of times, is you want to be as transparent as possible. Part of our job is to say when our budget is over, to say when there's a risk or an issue, to say when there's a resource that's not doing what they're supposed to do, not to get anybody or so on, but to move the work forward. And then I mentioned not empowering or trusting the team, that the team is the most important. So here's some closing thoughts. Look, I've done this for 3 decades, so I might be skewed, but I do believe project management is a great career to be in, especially if you have the mindset and competencies. Those competencies that I mentioned that can't be taught well. If you have those, you already have a leg up on maybe somebody who has more experience but not those competencies. There's plenty of tools and methodologies to learn from, plenty of best practices. Subscribe to my channel because I have 30 years of experience and 20 years of presentations from conferences that I've been putting up there, and it's free. So get my experience for free. Hopefully they're entertaining as well. But you can be a PM without experience. I think I demonstrated ways of doing that, and it requires just putting in an effort to do that. Consider the certification. It's not mandatory. Some companies value them, not all of them. Builds the credibility, but project management is learned through practice and not just certifications and reading books. So you just got to get in there and just do the work. Hopefully you found this useful and valuable. Let me know some feedback on it, and thanks for watching my video.